Doctor insults. White janitor in front of patient, unaware. The janitor owns the hospital. What would you do if you discovered that the person you belittled and dismissed was quietly running the very show you thought you controlled? What if the janitor cleaning up after you wasn't just an employee, but your boss, your superior, and the person holding your fate in their hands? Dr. Benjamin Carter, a top-tier surgeon at New Heights Medical Center, had no idea that his impulsive decision to insult a janitor in front of a patient would turn into the most humiliating moment of his career. What seemed like just another ordinary day at the hospital was about to unravel into a story of poetic justice, where arrogance meets its reckoning. New Heights Medical Center stood as a beacon of modern medicine, its glistening glass facade reflecting the sunlight over the bustling city. It was a sprawling complex of state-of-the-art facilities, where people from all walks of life came seeking hope, healing, and second chances. From the pristine marble floors to the sterile, impeccably maintained surgical wings, the hospital exuded an air of sophistication and exclusivity. Dr. Benjamin Carter was the very embodiment of this elite institution. With his impeccable suit under his white coat, a sharp jawline, and the confidence of someone who had aced every challenge in his life, he was admired, envied, and feared in equal measure. But beneath the polished exterior, Dr. Carter harbored a fatal flaw: his condescending arrogance. The story begins on an unusually chaotic morning in the hospital's main wing. A high-profile patient, Mr. Gerald Anderson, a real estate tycoon, had been admitted for a delicate heart surgery, and the entire staff was on edge. Dr. Carter strutted through the hallways like a king surveying his kingdom, his every step radiating authority. Meanwhile, in stark contrast, a quiet middle-aged man pushed a janitor's cart down the same hallway. Dressed in a faded uniform and worn sneakers, his presence was hardly noticed by the bustling medical staff. His name tag read Thomas, but no one ever bothered to address him by it. To them, he was just the janitor, invisible and unimportant. In one of the hospital's grand private rooms, Gerald Anderson sat nervously on the edge of his bed, clutching his chest lightly. Dr. Carter swept in with his usual theatrical flair, his booming voice filling the room as he assured the patient that he was in the hands of the best. Behind him, the janitor quietly worked, replacing the trash bag in the corner. Dr. Carter frowned as he caught sight of the janitor out of the corner of his eye. Turning to him, he snapped, "Do you mind? This is a private consultation. Go mop the floors somewhere else." Thomas nodded silently, his expression calm, and rolled his cart out without a word. But what no one, including Dr. Carter, realized was that Thomas wasn't just another janitor. He was Thomas Green, the majority shareholder of New Heights Medical Center and its true owner. For years, he had worked undercover, observing how his staff treated everyone, from the wealthiest patients to the most unassuming employees. Why would someone as wealthy and powerful as Thomas Green choose to work as a janitor? What had motivated him to take on such an unassuming role in his own empire? And more importantly, what would happen now that Dr. Carter, the pride of the hospital, had insulted him without a second thought? What unfolds next is a story of humbling realizations, where a powerful lesson about respect, humility, and the true measure of a person shakes the hospital's foundation. Stay tuned as the layers of this story unravel, revealing secrets that no one saw coming. As the story unfolds, we dive deep into the lives of the individuals at the center of the drama. Each character brings their own layers of complexity, secrets, and motivations that weave together into a web of intrigue. Richard Harper was the unassuming janitor who kept the hospital running like clockwork. At first glance, Richard appeared to be just another employee, a quiet, middle-aged man in his late 40s, with graying hair and calloused hands from years of labor. His colleagues often joked about his meticulous nature, calling him Mr. Clean, but few ever bothered to learn more about his life outside of work. Beneath his humble demeanor, Richard carried the weight of a profound secret. Unknown to his co-workers, he was the true owner of Crestwood Medical Center, the very hospital where he worked as a janitor. Having inherited the hospital from his late father, Richard had chosen to conceal his identity, to observe how his employees operated without the influence of his authority. He believed that true leadership meant understanding every layer of the organization, including its foundations. His motivations for taking on such an unconventional role were rooted in a deep-seated philosophy passed down from his father. You can only lead if you understand the struggles of those you lead. To Richard, every scrub floor and empty trash bin was a lesson in humility and a chance to see the cracks in the system firsthand. But his quiet existence would soon take a sharp turn when a high-profile doctor disrespected him in a way that would alter the course of their lives forever. Dr. Leonard Steele, a celebrated cardiothoracic surgeon, was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. Tall, with piercing blue eyes and a perfectly tailored suit beneath his white coat, Dr. Steele radiated confidence, or, as some would say, arrogance. His reputation as the best heart surgeon in the state had earned him accolades, high salaries, and a godlike status among his peers. But beneath the polished exterior, Dr. Steele harbored an unsavory side. He viewed himself as superior to nearly everyone around him, especially those he considered beneath his station. To him, people like Richard were invisible, mere cogs in the machine of his success. He had no patience for what he deemed incompetence or mediocrity, and he wasn't shy about making his disdain known, often at the expense of those who couldn't defend themselves. Dr. Steele's hunger for recognition and power stemmed from his own insecurities. Born into a modest family, he had clawed his way to the top, determined to never feel small or insignificant again. But his ruthless ambition came at a cost. Strained relationships, questionable ethics, and a blind spot for the humanity of those around him. It was only a matter of time before his unchecked arrogance collided with Richard's quiet strength, igniting a conflict that would unravel everything Dr. Steele thought he knew about success and power. Amanda Fields was a young and bright nurse in her late 20s, fresh out of nursing school and eager to make a difference. She had a natural empathy that drew patients to her, and her quick thinking often earned her praise from colleagues. However, Amanda found herself walking a fine line in the hospital hierarchy. As a nurse, she had witnessed Dr. Steele's condescending behavior on numerous occasions, but she felt powerless to speak out. Nurses like her were often dismissed or overlooked, their voices drowned out by the authority of doctors like Steele. Yet Amanda couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of injustice she felt every time she saw someone humiliated or mistreated under his watch. Her connection to Richard was different. She had noticed his quiet diligence and often stopped to chat with him during her breaks. Over time, Amanda became one of the few people who knew a little more about Richard's background, though she was unaware of his true identity. She admired his humility and found solace in their shared moments of humanity in an otherwise cold, hierarchical environment. Amanda would later find herself at the center of the storm that erupted between Richard and Dr. Steele. Her role as a witness and advocate for fairness would challenge her to find her own voice and stand up for what was right, even at great personal risk. Sarah Williams was an elderly patient recovering from heart surgery under Dr. Steele's care. A retired schoolteacher, Sarah had a sharp wit and an unshakable sense of justice despite her frail condition. She had a knack for observing people, often noticing things that others missed. Sarah quickly formed a bond with Richard, who frequently stopped by her room to tidy up or simply offer a kind word. She saw in him a dignity that transcended his janitorial uniform, and her curiosity was piqued. She also observed Dr. Steele's condescending treatment of Richard, which she found both appalling and ironic, given that Richard was one of the few staff members who genuinely seemed to care about her well-being. It was Sarah's sharp tongue and unyielding spirit that would become the catalyst for the confrontation that exposed Dr. Steele's true character and Richard's hidden identity. Unafraid to speak her mind, Sarah would play a pivotal role in unraveling the dynamics of power, respect, and humanity within the hospital walls. The ordinary routine of Crestwood Medical Center was shattered one unremarkable Monday morning when chaos erupted in the hospital's pristine halls. It began in the quiet hours before dawn, with the faint sound of hurried footsteps and muffled voices growing louder as they echoed through the corridors. By the time the sun rose, the emergency alarms were blaring and word spread like wildfire. Richard Harper, the hospital's janitor, had been found unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, in one of the hospital's supply closets. It was Amanda Fields who found him. Starting her early morning shift, she was passing by the East Wing when she noticed the door to the janitorial supply room ajar. The dim light spilling out into the hallway caught her attention. Curious and slightly concerned, Amanda peeked inside, only to find Richard slumped against the wall, motionless. His mop lay discarded beside him, its handle snapped in two. A pool of blood had gathered under his head, staining the grey tiles a deep crimson. Amanda's screams drew a crowd almost immediately, with staff members and patients alike rushing to the scene. Among them was Dr. Leonard Steele, who dismissed the commotion as hospital drama and pushed past Amanda to get a better look. His face paled slightly as he saw Richard, but he quickly masked his reaction, barking orders for someone to call security and get a gurney. By the time the local police arrived, the hospital's security team had already cordoned off the area. Detective Julia Hayes, a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor, was assigned to the case. With her sharp eyes and calm composure, she immediately began surveying the scene. The supply closet was small and cluttered, its shelves lined with cleaning supplies, latex gloves, and disinfectant bottles. It didn't take long for Detective Hayes to notice the blood splatter on the wall behind Richard's head, suggesting he had been struck with considerable force. Nearby, she found the broken mop handle, one end splintered and jagged, as if it had been used as a weapon. While paramedics worked to stabilize Richard and rush him to the emergency room, Detective Hayes began her initial round of questioning. The first person Hayes spoke to was Amanda, whose voice trembled as she recounted how she had found Richard. "He was always here early," she explained. cleaning the halls before the day shift started. I thought it was odd to see the door open like that. He's usually so careful. Amanda's account painted a picture of a diligent worker, but it offered no clues as to who might have attacked him. When pressed about any unusual behavior she'd noticed recently, Amanda hesitated before mentioning an argument she had overheard a week earlier. It was between Richard and Dr. Steele, she admitted. I didn't catch much, but Dr. Steele seemed angry. He called Richard incompetent and said something about knowing his place. Next, Detective Hayes turned her attention to Dr. Steele, whose polished demeanor seemed unshaken by the unfolding events. When asked about his relationship with Richard, Steele brushed off the question with a dismissive wave. I barely knew the man, he claimed. He was just a janitor. Our paths didn't cross much. But Hayes wasn't convinced. Amanda's statement suggested otherwise, and there was something about Steele's clipped responses and rigid posture that hinted at more. As the investigation continued, hospital security provided footage from a nearby hallway camera. The grainy video, timestamped just before 5 a.m., showed Richard entering the supply closet. Moments later, a tall figure in scrubs followed him in, though the camera angle obscured their face. The footage cut off shortly after, offering no further clues. The figure's identity became a point of contention. While Amanda and a few other nurses believed the figure resembled Dr. Steele, others argued it could have been any of the hospital staff, given the standard issue scrubs. Adding to the confusion was the lack of fingerprints on the mop handle. Whoever had attacked Richard had either worn gloves or wiped down the weapon, indicating premeditation. However, a small but telling piece of evidence emerged when a single strand of hair was found on Richard's uniform. Preliminary analysis suggested it belonged to a man, but further testing was needed to confirm a match. Meanwhile, rumors began circulating among the hospital staff. Some whispered that Richard had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, perhaps a secret involving hospital finances or illegal activities. Others speculated that the attack was personal, tied to the friction between Richard and Dr. Steele. As more staff members were interviewed, the narrative grew murkier. One nurse, who asked to remain anonymous, claimed she had seen Richard arguing with another janitor, Michael Tran, just days before the attack. Michael, who had been Richard's subordinate for years, was known for his short temper and resentment toward authority figures. When questioned, Michael admitted to the argument, but denied any involvement in the attack. Yeah, we had our disagreements, he said, his voice defensive. But I'd never hurt the guy. He was my boss, sure, but he wasn't a bad one. Another twist came when a patient reported seeing a shadowy figure leaving the supply closet shortly after 5:15 a.m. The patient, Sarah Williams, described the figure as hurried and nervous, but her account was vague, and she admitted her vision wasn't the best without her glasses. By the end of the day, Detective Hayes was left with more questions than answers. Who was the figure in the hallway footage? Why had someone gone to such lengths to conceal their involvement? And most importantly, what motive could anyone possibly have for attacking a janitor who kept to himself? The absence of clear answers only heightened the tension. As the hospital staff braced themselves for the fallout, whispers of fear and suspicion crept into every corner of Crestwood Medical Center. With Richard in critical condition and unable to provide his side of the story, the mystery deepened, leaving everyone to wonder, Who could have done this? And why? As Detective Hayes prepared to dive deeper into the lives of those involved, she knew one thing for certain. The truth was buried somewhere in the layers of secrets and lies that surrounded this seemingly ordinary hospital. It was her job to unravel them, one piece at a time. The investigation into Richard Harper's attack was anything but straightforward. Each new lead seemed to unravel into a maze of contradictions, keeping Detective Julia Hayes and her team on edge. The deeper they dug, the murkier the case became, with every step forward leading to unforeseen twists and dead ends. 2 days after the incident, an envelope arrived at the precinct, addressed to Detective Hayes. Inside was a hastily scribbled note. Look into Dr. Steele. He has secrets to hide. The message was unsigned, written in block letters that gave no indication of the sender's identity. At first glance, it seemed to confirm Amanda's earlier suspicions about Dr. Steele's involvement. Detective Hayes immediately subpoenaed Steele's financial records, phone logs, and emails. What she found, however, was nothing short of a surprise. Steele's personal bank account had a series of unusual transactions, large, regular payments to a private medical practice located out of state. The practice belonged to a former colleague of Steele's, who had lost his medical license under questionable circumstances. When confronted, Steele admitted to the payments, but vehemently denied any connection to the attack. I was helping an old friend, he insisted, his frustration evident. I may be cold, but I'm not a criminal. The investigation into Steele's finances temporarily distracted the team, but ultimately it yielded no direct connection to Richard's attack. While Steele's behavior remained suspicious, Hayes realized the note might have been planted to mislead her, raising the question, who would want to shift attention away from themselves? As Hayes tried to untangle the threads, a nurse approached her with an unexpected piece of evidence. Richard's personal notebook, which had been found in his locker. The notebook was filled with daily observations and cryptic shorthand that seemed to document the comings and goings of hospital staff. One particular entry stood out. MT in storage room after hours. Same box as last week. Doesn't look right. The initials MT immediately pointed to Michael Tran, Richard's subordinate. Hayes brought Michael in for questioning, but his reaction only deepened the mystery. That's not true, Michael stammered, his usual bravado replaced by visible unease. I don't even know what he's talking about. Hayes wasn't convinced. The entry hinted at something suspicious, possibly theft or even smuggling. But when the storage room was searched, it appeared normal. No incriminating evidence was found, and Michael was released without charge. Still, the unresolved implication of Richard's note lingered, casting a shadow over Michael and fueling speculation among the staff. The hair strand found on Richard's uniform seemed like a promising lead. When forensic testing confirmed it belonged to a male, hopes rose that the investigation was gaining traction. Yet, when the results came back, they showed no match in the hospital's personnel database or local records. This revelation left the team baffled. If the attacker wasn't a hospital employee, or someone with a criminal history, then who were they? Had the perpetrator been an outsider with access to the hospital, or was the evidence planted to mislead the investigators? The absence of a match frustrated Hayes, but it also added to the growing sense of unease. The attacker seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fragments of their presence. As Hayes combed through additional surveillance footage, she noticed something strange in the hours leading up to the attack. At approximately 4:30 a.m., a figure resembling Richard was seen arguing with another person in the hospital's staff parking lot. While the footage was too grainy to identify the second individual, their body language was aggressive, with wild hand gestures and pacing. The argument ended abruptly when the second figure stormed off, disappearing into the building. Curiously, Richard didn't follow, but instead remained by his car for several minutes before heading inside. The timing raised questions. What had the argument been about, and why hadn't Richard reported it? Despite an extensive search for witnesses, no one could recall seeing the confrontation, leaving the team to speculate whether it might hold the key to the attack. A new suspect emerged when a delivery driver, identified as Sam Peterson, came forward with a strange story. On the morning of the attack, Sam had been making a routine drop-off at the hospital's east entrance when he noticed a man pacing outside the supply closet. He looked nervous, Sam explained. Kept glancing around, like he was waiting for someone. I thought about saying something, but I figured it wasn't my business. When shown a photo lineup, Sam hesitated before pointing to Michael Tran, though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure. The identification seemed to strengthen the case against Michael, but it unraveled when Michael's alibi was confirmed by time-stamped security footage showing him in the cafeteria at the time of the incident. Sam's account, while intriguing, ultimately led nowhere, leaving Hayes to wonder if he had simply been mistaken, or if the real suspect had been deliberately framing Michael. Richard Harper finally regained consciousness a week after the attack, but to everyone's dismay, his memory of the incident was non-existent. The blow to his head had caused retrograde amnesia, erasing any recollection of the events leading up to the attack. While Richard was able to confirm some details from his notebook, he couldn't explain the entry about Michael Tran or his late-night observations in the storage room. His frustration was palpable, but so was his fear. They were after something, Richard said during one interview. I don't know what it was, but I feel like I was in the way. His vague statement only added to the mystery, leaving Hayes grappling with more questions than answers. Detective Hayes wasn't working alone. Her partner, Detective Carlos Vega, approached the case with a sharp intuition that often complemented Hayes's methodical style. Together, they brainstormed theories, analyzed evidence, and worked to eliminate dead ends. At one point, Vega suggested the possibility of a larger conspiracy. What if this isn't about Richard at all, he speculated. What if he stumbled onto something bigger, something someone didn't want getting out? The idea was compelling, but without concrete evidence, it remained a theory. Still, it pushed Hayes to widen her scope, examining hospital records, supply orders, and even patient files for any anomalies. Just as the case seemed to hit a standstill, another shocking development occurred. A second hospital staff member, Amanda Fields, was found unconscious in the stairwell, her wrist broken and her face bruised. This time, a note was left behind, tucked into her pocket. Stay out of it. The chilling message sent shockwaves through the hospital, reigniting fear and suspicion among the staff. For Hayes, it was a turning point. Whoever was behind these attacks wasn't just trying to hide. They were sending a warning. As the investigation continued, the hospital staff was on edge. With each day bringing new rumors and suspicions. Detective Hayes was at a breaking point. Every lead seemed to circle back on itself, and the pressure to solve the case was mounting. Just when it seemed like they were about to hit another dead end, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the hospital's IT department. An analyst named Greg Bennett had been reviewing the surveillance footage for anything they might have missed. He had been focusing on the time around the attack, searching for any anomalies. It was then that he noticed something unusual in the security logs. At 3:45 a.m., when Richard Harper was supposedly in his office, there was a sudden, unexplained surge of activity on his work computer. A series of files were accessed and deleted in rapid succession. At first, it seemed like a simple glitch, but Bennett's instincts told him something wasn't right. Hayes immediately followed up on the lead. The deleted files were recovered, and they revealed something startling. Richard had been secretly accessing patient records that were classified as highly confidential. The files belonged to several high-profile individuals, including a major donor to the hospital's foundation and an influential city politician. It appeared that Richard had been digging into sensitive, possibly scandalous, information, something no one at the hospital had known about. The most shocking discovery came when one of the files contained a detailed report of a medical malpractice case involving Dr. James Steele, the head of the hospital's surgical department. Steele had been accused of misdiagnosing a high-profile patient, resulting in irreversible complications. The case had been quietly swept under the rug years ago, but Richard's interest in the file was a clear indication that he had uncovered something he shouldn't have. As the details unraveled, it became clear. Richard Harper hadn't been the innocent bystander he had appeared to be. He had been digging into dangerous territory, and his attack wasn't a random act of violence. It was a direct response to his discovery of something much bigger than a mere hospital scandal. Richard had unearthed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the institution. The attack was a warning to keep quiet, but Richard had paid the price for his curiosity. For Detective Hayes, the revelation was both a victory and a punch to the gut. She had suspected that the case wasn't just about a random assault, but this discovery brought everything into sharp focus. Richard's life had been in jeopardy because of what he knew. Hayes' mind raced as she pieced together the new information. Someone in the hospital had been willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. But who? The discovery of Richard's involvement in a deeper conspiracy sent shockwaves through the investigation. But it was the emotional toll that truly raised the stakes for Detective Hayes. The tension of the case weighed heavily on her, as she had grown close to Richard's family during the investigation. Richard's wife, Claire, had been a constant presence at the hospital, waiting for news of her husband's condition. Hayes had seen the toll it took on Claire, the fear in her eyes, the sleepless nights, the desperate hope that her husband would pull through. But with this new information, everything changed. Claire, a woman who had trusted the man she loved, was now faced with the painful realization that her husband had been involved in a shady world of hospital politics, secrets, and corruption. In a gut-wrenching moment, Claire came face to face with Detective Hayes after the breakthrough discovery. Hayes had been dreading this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. As Claire learned about Richard's actions, her face went from shock to disbelief, then to anger. The woman who had stood by her husband's side was now grappling with the revelation that the man she had known, loved, and built a life with was caught up in a dark world she couldn't understand. "I don't believe it," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Richard wouldn't do this. He wouldn't put us in danger like this." The emotional toll on Claire was palpable, but Hayes knew this was just the beginning of the fallout. The truth had come to light, but it was far from over. How would Richard's actions affect his family? Would Claire ever be able to forgive him for putting their lives at risk? And would she ever be able to reconcile her memories of the man she loved with the man he had become? Meanwhile, Hayes felt her own emotions simmer beneath the surface. This case had become more than just a professional investigation. It had turned into a personal battle. The victims were no longer faceless strangers. They were real people, with families and lives that had been shattered by greed, corruption, and violence. And Hayes, too, was now part of the story. She wasn't just chasing a criminal. She was chasing the truth, and the truth was more complicated and more dangerous than she ever could have imagined. With the new information about Richard's involvement in the hospital's web of corruption, Hayes was faced with an impossible choice. She had been a detective for years, but this case felt different. It was no longer about simply solving the crime. It was about deciding how far she was willing to go for the truth. Hayes knew that the higher-ups in the hospital, including Dr. Steele, would do whatever it took to cover up their secrets. The stakes had never been higher. If she pushed too hard, she risked putting herself and her team in danger. But the more she uncovered, the more it became clear that the conspiracy went deeper than anyone had anticipated. Richard's discovery was just the tip of the iceberg, and the people behind it were ruthless. With Claire's emotional breakdown still fresh in her mind, Hayes made a critical decision. She would press forward with the investigation, no matter the personal cost. She couldn't back down now, not after everything Richard had sacrificed to uncover the truth. But she also knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger. If she wasn't careful, she could lose more than just her career. She could lose everything. In the end, the decision was made. She would expose the conspiracy, no matter how much it would hurt. For Claire, for Richard, for everyone who had been affected by the hospital's corruption. It was a decision that would change the course of the investigation and possibly Hayes's life forever. The truth had to come out, and there was no turning back. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the hospital's web of corruption began to unravel at a rapid pace. Detective Hayes, armed with the evidence she had painstakingly uncovered, moved forward with the decision to expose the entire truth. The pieces of the puzzle, Richard's hidden discoveries, the files he accessed, and the people involved, came together in an airtight case. But bringing the truth to light was no small feat. The first major breakthrough came when Hayes presented the evidence to the local authorities. The shocking discovery of the secret medical malpractice case involving Dr. Steele and the high-profile individuals had far-reaching consequences. The investigation exposed a long history of illegal activity, falsified patient records, bribes, and even cover-ups of catastrophic medical errors. The hospital, once considered a beacon of trust, was now under intense scrutiny from the media, government regulators, and the public. In the court of law, Dr. Steele and several others connected to the corruption were charged with multiple counts, including malpractice, bribery, and conspiracy. The trial was long and highly publicized, with each day bringing new revelations. Steele, who had once enjoyed an untouchable position within the hospital, now found himself facing a lengthy prison sentence. His downfall was swift, and though his lawyers fought to minimize his punishment, the evidence was irrefutable. The trial's outcome sent a clear message. No one, regardless of their status, was above the law. As the trial played out, the hospital's leadership was shaken to its core. Key figures who had once protected Steele and perpetuated the culture of corruption were ousted. The community, devastated by the extent of the wrongdoing, demanded accountability. What had once been a proud institution was now in disarray, its reputation shattered. For Detective Hayes, the resolution brought a bittersweet sense of closure. She had done what she set out to do, expose the truth, even when it meant going up against powerful forces. But the toll the case had taken on her, and on everyone involved, was not lost on her. The investigation was now over, but the damage it had caused would reverberate for years to come. In the end, justice was served, but at a cost. The truth, though uncovered, had destroyed lives in the process. Richard, once a man of integrity, was now marked by his own missteps. Claire had lost not just her husband, but the life they had built together. Dr. Steele's fall from grace was swift, but it was also an inevitable outcome of a system that had enabled his actions for years. As the dust settled, Detective Hayes was left with a lingering question. Was there truly closure when the wounds were so deep? The hospital's recovery would take years, and some of the victims would never heal from the betrayal they had endured. The investigation had exposed the corruption, but it hadn't healed the pain caused by it. And then, just when Hayes thought the case was finally closed, a final twist surfaced. A new anonymous tip arrived, suggesting that there was another individual, someone even closer to the center of the conspiracy, who had managed to escape the fallout entirely. Hayes's heart sank as she realized the case was far from over. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about ensuring that justice continued to be served, even when the answers were incomplete. The shadows of the past still lingered, and Detective Hayes knew that she would never truly walk away from this case. There would always be more to uncover, more to fight for, and more to expose. As the dust settles and the courtrooms grow quiet, the lingering questions about the nature of crime and justice remain. This case, though resolved on the surface, unveils a deeper truth about human psychology and the complexity of moral choices. What does it mean when the truth comes at such a high cost? Can justice ever truly be served when the damage done is irreparable? As each character navigates the aftermath, their fates serve as reminders that the search for truth often uncovers more than we expect, and sometimes more than we can handle. The personal toll of this investigation, especially on the Harper family, reveals a harsh reality. The pursuit of justice often comes at the expense of the very people it is meant to protect. Richard Harper, though partly a hero, found his own choices leading him down a path from which he could never return. Claire Harper, in the wake of the devastation, had to rebuild her life, an act of courage, but one fraught with emotional scars. The story of Dr. Steele, once a man of power and prestige, now a symbol of corruption, brings to light the human capacity for manipulation and greed, even in the face of moral destruction. For Detective Hayes, the case has exposed the complexities of law enforcement, the grey areas where right and wrong are not always so clear. Despite her success, there is no true satisfaction in solving a case that leaves so much pain behind. She wonders, as many do, whether true justice is even attainable in a world so broken. Is it possible for the scales to balance when some things can never be made right? As the case officially closes, the future remains uncertain. The hospital begins the long road to recovery, but some victims may never find peace. New details about other possible individuals involved in the conspiracy continue to surface, suggesting that this might not be the end after all. Though the investigation concluded, a lingering sense of unfinished business remains. Perhaps in the end, no one ever truly walks away unscathed, and the truth itself is just a fleeting moment before the next wave of uncertainty strikes.